Hello, we're excited to bring you another edition of our alumni podcast, Bundle of Arrows. I'm joined by some new guests today: Anna Demchuk from Enoch Cree Nation, Ernest Jack from Westbank First Nation, and Ty Thomson from White Bear First Nation. So I'd love to have you each introduce yourselves and let us know a little bit more about you and your community and the work that you do. So with that, I'll go with Anna.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Anna Demchuk-Morin from the Enoch Cree Nation. I've been the tax manager out here probably for the last 10, 15 years. I also work with our water called EUL. And I represent Enoch, which actually owns the River Cree Resort and Casino. I'm sure some of you have visited our casinos from time to time. And at the very beginning, I learned from just on the go without any of the taxation courses or anything. And then eventually I met up with Ty at some of the taxation courses we decided to take back in 2016, 2017, or 2018, somewhere in there. And Ernest and I go way back too. So, anyway, it's nice to be able to work with all of you and looking forward to this podcast.
Thanks, Anna. Ernest?
Hi, I'm Tyson Thomson. I'm from White Bear First Nation out in Saskatchewan. I've been working for the nation going on my fifth year now. I came through the Tulo courses, which are, amazing for me as a person. It helped me build my capacity coming in straight from the oil field to be able to understand the need in my community for taxation and what it really is about. I know there's a lot of information out there that's not necessarily um,
True.
true. Yeah, when it comes to taxation and yeah, no, I'm happy to be here and thanks for inviting me and I'm excited.
Thank you. My name is Ernest Jack. I'm the surveyor of taxes for the Westbank First Nation. I've worked for Westbank for it'll be 20 years in March and have been in property tax since 1991. So I don't know, what's the math? 32 years?
Oh,
Long time anyway. And as far as Westbank is concerned, we are just going to be over 3 billion in assessed values this coming year. So we've been growing continuously, and it never stops being interesting. That's for sure. Um, so I'm really excited to be able to talk with everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So, in our last episode, we ended up chatting a little bit about taxpayer communications and relationship building with taxpayers. But of course, that's not the only people that you have to communicate with regularly in your jobs. I'm just curious about some of the questions that you might receive from your community members in doing tax administration, or what it looks like communicating with chief and council, some of those questions that you might get from them, and then how you address them.
okay, if I can jump in first, if you guys don't mind. For me, we're under custom elections now. We used to be under the Indian Act, but every 3 years we have an election. So I always find it so important that you get new leaders. We have 11 leaders, and this year half were new ones. So every time we have an election, I make sure I do a bit of an orientation with the new chief and council, because even though we have some of the old ones continuing on, we have the new ones that are just learning. So some of them wonder, what do we do as tax administrators? They have to be informed about the laws, the main laws and the annual laws. And some of it can be overwhelming because even though they get elected, doesn't mean they know everything that's involved with the taxation area. So usually I try to do a bit of a binder and an orientation, going over questions with them and informing them about the annual laws every years. And it's funny because usually chief and council do their budgets in January, but I have to wait to do the expenditure law. So we do a draft budget with chief and council, and then I tell them it's not really 100% approved until I do my expenditure law. So then that takes a little bit of a learning curve because they just think their word is 100%. But I said it's based on what my taxes also generate. So anyway, I really think it's important that all of us go through new leadership that it's better to communicate with them and make sure that they really know what you're doing and where you're coming from, and especially paying attention to the laws, that they take the time to read them. Sometimes I'll give them an assignment and say, here's your reading material for tonight. I know it's boring, but I would appreciate you looking at it. And feel free to call me if you have any questions. And no question is a dumb question, because they're learning too, just like we were. So really try to, I don't know, help them along, just because I know they're new at it. And rather than pretending to know what it is all about, I would rather them be informed. So that's what I usually try to do, especially with the new leadership.
No, that's awesome. No, I think for me at White Bear, I came into a system that was there wasn't a lot of enforcement. So when I started, I had a mentor, a consultant who did our taxation for about 20 years, and there wasn't a lot of communication that was happening between our council and him. And when I came in, I felt that there was a need to sit down with some of our council members and kind of go over what the goals were. And it was always the same as, we have a project that we've been trying to get done for about 20 years, and they just wanted it to get done. So for me, I learned to communicate as direct as I could with our council. Kind of, I figured we determined the priority of the nation when it came to taxation, and I kind of took it from there and communicated that, the steps to get there, and I broke it down for them, and why we haven't been able to achieve it, and they were happy. They were happy with what I was able to tell them, and they were able to understand why there was such a long delay in what had happened. And a lot of it had to do with the FMA not being established, or implemented, sorry, and then just a lack of capacity, having capacity issues there, and addressing them, and once we addressed them, they were on board for getting the project done.
Recently, we had an election at the Westbank First Nation, and we brought back a previous chief that had served for off and on for 20 years, Chief Robert Louis. So he understands the tax situation, and but we had an orientation situation where I came and presented for, I think it was about 2 hours, just on the processes of how property tax works, how the budget is established, how our rates are, considerations for what our future is going to look like. And when we pass a law, we have an established process that goes to our advisory council after first reading, and then it goes back to council again. And if there's any significant changes, we have to review those and present them. But that's our lawmaking process. And as far as an interesting question from the community, we had one of our people in public works want to know what we spend the tax money on, and one of the response I gave was, well, pays for your job. I mean, we fund you 100%. Your equipment that you drive around in, the tools that you use, those are all paid for by property tax money or revenues. So that was the benefit, and he was really happy to know that. But that's one of the things that we're also going to concentrate on, is getting the message out to the community on what are the things that we actually make contributions for tax money, and the differences between what the members can expect and what the non-member residents can expect. And we have going on 12,000 of them. So
Wow.
that's an interesting view, that's for sure.
I loved the idea of like the orientation package, Anna, and I can imagine that putting that time in at the very beginning when you do have a new council would help, like you said, get everybody up to speed faster, and maybe with a better understanding of some of the work that you do as tax administrators, then their questions wouldn't be so about the basics. It would be more interesting questions, like they understand it a bit better. Do you find that the learning that you're able to help that learning curve with that orientation? Have you tried doing, did you do it, have you gone through an election cycle where you didn't do that and noticed a difference in the level
Um,
of understanding?
I think when I first took over, we had another person that used to look after it in the finance department, but they really didn't pay attention to the taxation area. There's like $500,000 owing when I jumped in. So anyway, and they thought, oh, that's, it was from 10 years ago. But I said, well, I don't care. I talked to legal and we can still collect it. So I told the chief and counsel at that time that, it still qualifies to be paid because it was outstanding taxes. So anyway, I jumped in and luckily I got $500,000 paid to the band. It took me maybe 3 months, but I did it because I know Ty knows me. I'm usually like a dog with a bone. I'm going to go and get it. If you owe us money, I'm going to try collect it from you. And I did. And then we had some leadership at the time that didn't understand the laws because we've been in taxation since the 1970s under the Indian Act, under Section 83, because we were oil rich and we have tons of lines running through our reserve. So anyway, back in the day, we collected taxes since then, but some band members really weren't aware of that. It's a huge learning curve because sometimes they don't think you can do what you can do with those laws, but those laws give us so much power. And if you have an understanding from leadership and the elders and the community and the taxpayers that those are our laws. And I don't think we've ever lost a case in court if it's ever went to court that the taxpayer learns pretty fast that they have to pay it and we're being reasonable. So I think the other thing I do too with the orientation kit is some council this year asked for what areas can we spend it on. So with the FMA toolkit, they're really helpful with outlining exactly which areas they can spend money on. So that's really helpful too, to include any appendices that you can to clarify stuff like that. So then they know that they can't do a per diem, that they have to spend in certain areas. Some band members think, well, hey, why can't you just split it up amongst us and do a per diem? So then you tell them pretty fast, well, we can't do that, and this is why. So I think the more informed they are, the more helpful it is to the community members and understanding those laws.
Yeah, no, I remember when I first came in, and like I said, we had a little bit of the department was a little bit unorganized, and I didn't really have any any documents to go by my history. I actually relied heavily on the FNTC to provide me with our and the Gazette to provide me with any historical laws, our annual laws. I moved into an office, and they gave me a new computer, and they said, here you go, tax man. you know, Go hard. Um, but I was able to lean on FNTC heavily at the time. But you just reminded me that I was actually working on through with the toolkit from FNTC. I was working on the tax. I don't think it's called a binder, but like they give you a template to do your First Nations sort of tax information for people, so that you can hand it out to your leadership. And that's something you
It's
reminded me
cool.
about. I should get back on that. I have lots of updating to do to that one. Um, but yeah, no, I think for me, um, over the years, like right from my first year, I've only been in this for 5 years, but I've really learned that you have to take different strategy when you're communicating with your leadership and with your members and with your leaseholders. For me, I think it's really important for me to share my experience with my the first council I was working under. Basically, it was, I had to communicate what we were missing out on, the potential of our project, and and the gaps that we needed to fill before we could actually get it done. And with our members, it was more of a, um, we need to get this done. This is what we're missing out on, and I know that's the strategy that we're taught at Tulo, and it really does work. And when I talk to our lessees or our cottagers association back home, I make sure that they understand that I'm here to protect them and make sure that they're treated fairly, and that we deal with their concerns, and we're not necessarily here to gouge them. I'm going to make sure that that doesn't happen, and I give them a rundown of the process, and reassure them that we're using the same assessors that they works everywhere else in Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan's a little bit of a different monster when it comes to assessment and the cycle that they use there. That was a big adjustment for me, but I was able to work through it and communicate the differences between where I got my training in BC and the Saskatchewan assessment cycle with my council, and that played a big role in the reason that we weren't able to get our project done sooner than we have. But yeah, I think that's really important to focus on a strategy before you start communicating, because you can go down the wrong path sometimes.
I think it's important to establish with your community that taxation revenues are actually first and foremost public funds, and they're not like the First Nations, to do with whatever they want to do with fund. And you have to, inform your council right from the very start that there are a lot of strings attached to the revenues and responsibilities that you have to the taxpayers in protecting their confidentiality, and having them understand what you're spending the money on, and that it's an allowable expense. I also like to tell council that property tax jurisdiction is the purest form of sovereignty that you have, and then your enforcement of that. It's something that that's hard to define unless you define it for them and share with them that that's why it's a huge responsibility, not only for your members but for your non-member residents. Thank you.
Yeah, you all have made some really great points. I think a couple of things that you touched on that are interesting to me. So one, I know in this area of work, we do talk about tax with people that don't really have an understanding. Some of the things that you said, that people think it might be based on income, or even when they hear property tax, that they think it might be a tax on members. And what we're really talking about is non-member occupiers on our lands. And then really, I know in class we talk a lot about pre-contact, or what it looked like in the early days, and just that concept of taxes, the Chinook TAKSIS, this concept where if another nation was hunting on your territory or crossing your lands, there would be some kind of payment for that, and how the idea of taxation is so inherent to our governance. I've enjoyed those conversations in class. And another thing that you spoke to that reminded me of previous conversations on this podcast was just about the support that the Tax Commission, the First Nations Tax Commission, provides. Somebody else spoke about before they came to the Tulo Centre, they didn't realize that there was just a real wealth of resources at the Tax Commission. Ty, you mentioned the First Nations Gazette, www.fng.ca. There's been a lot of work in this area to help tax administrators be successful in their jobs. But there is still, I think, a lot of unfamiliarity about what the role of a tax administrator is within our band administration. So just really like to hear what your annual cycle looks like. What are those things that will keep you busy from month to month, and what your day to day can look like just doing in your role as a tax administrator.
I'll jump in and just say that, your role is so important because one of the things that we learn at Tulo too through the courses is that you make a schedule. You make a schedule as to what you do now, what you do in January, February, etc. And even though you put out the tax notices, that then you got to have a collections time because some people don't pay it on time. Then you got to collect that also. But before you even start that, you have to make sure that you have a good appraiser, that you have a relationship with your appraiser that knows your area. Because I'm Alberta, Ty, Saskatchewan, different regulations, and Ernest is BC. So all of us have different regulations to follow. And for me, we're oil and gas rich in Alberta. So we also have an Alberta board that we have to go to for the linear, and we have to approve our assessor through this Alberta board in order for us to get the assessment done with all our linear. And for Enoch, we have probably about 600 lines that run through our area. So I think it's really important to have a good relationship. As one of your job tasks is to build that relationship with an assessor. And I've been very lucky. My late dad actually handled the taxes way back in the 70s when he was on council. And the tax assessor we have now, his dad worked with my dad. And then now I'm working with the son, and we have a relationship. So it's really cool because he also helped us with some land claims information because they were involved with our taxation stuff for the last 40 years or so. So it's cool to have those kind of relationships, and it can only be done if your job description, if that's what you're working in, and then you add on to doing extra by, I go for lunch with him, we talk about different things so that we have that relationship building, and then just keeping on task because when we went through the pandemic, um, I was laid off for a month, but it was really weird. And I think I was the only tax administrator probably laid off because some of the new council didn't realize how important your job was. So within about a month, I was getting called, Anna, we need you back. None of us can do your job, blah, blah, blah. That, we realized the importance of we got to get this done. We got to get that done. And then also, if you have a loan with the First Nations Finance Authority, you have to meet the regulations and make sure you get everything done with all the laws and all of that stuff. So all those scenarios have to fit in, and your role is so important to make sure that you do your tax job and that your laws are followed and that everything is abided by and that you meet those deadline dates. I know at the Tulu course, that really helped me with having a schedule so you know exactly what you have to do and when it has to be done. Um, we tried to hire a consultant a long time ago that tried to make us a schedule, but I threw that out. I said that schedule, we already have our own schedule because Tulu was so good with teaching us that in class that you don't need a consultant to come in and tell you you have a schedule. That Tulu really gives you those resources so that you know exactly what you have to do and when you have to do it. You don't have to waste money on a consultant. If you know your job, you'll get it done exactly when you need to get it done and follow the cycle so that you know everything is done on time. And I think you're more appreciated that way because I think that, whoa, your job is important. I can't just lay you off. So anyway, for me, that was a good learning experience for my leadership at the time.
Yeah, no. For me out in White Bear, I think we have a 1,000 lot residential development on reserve, but we've only implemented our commercial and industrial property taxes. So same thing. We're oil rich. We most of our folios are oil and gas. A few pipeline folios. Majority of the time, for me it's data entry. My day to day stuff and enforcement's been pretty smooth for me. Knock on wood. I know I'm shifting into residential property taxes this year, and I know that's going to come with some, maybe some appeals, maybe some different scenarios that I haven't had to deal with yet. But I think, um, you know, for me, I guess as a tax administrator, and where I come from, I think the most important thing for me the last 5 years has been being able to create a strategy, strategize with my council and some of our administrators staff on implementing, you know, some land management systems. Because we were weak, I was able to help, especially with my training at Tulo, my certificate that I got out of there, in the lands program. It helped me be able to communicate with our lands manager, you know, that there were some outstanding issues in housekeeping that we needed to figure out before we could actually implement our property taxes. You know, when I came in, we were collecting property taxes, our commercial property taxes, from 2008 to 2018 is when I started. And my first weekend, the council had just approved their assessment law. So we were just implementing a law that we've been collecting taxes on. So I was able to go through it and look at it, and I right away I identified that we weren't on the proper schedule, and I actually had to make some amendments right off the hop as soon as I was fresh out of Tulo and given my computer and my desk, and I had to start with some hard stuff right off the hop. So it's been pretty smooth sailing so far, but there have been instances like that where, you know, you get thrown into the fire and you have to figure it out. And, you know, you're schooling, and I do refer back to my textbooks all the time. You know, I have to. They're on my main screen, so it's kind of where I'm at when I'm working. You know, I'm kind of all over the place. It's sort of organized chaos, sometimes is what I like to call it.
Well, I'm sure Andre will love to hear that you reference the textbooks regularly and that they're on your desktop.
Well, there's no question about a tax cycle. We've been running our tax cycle for ever since I've been involved in property tax in the very beginning, practically the first day. That was the first thing we had to understand. Well, what do you do? When do you do it? How do you do it? And who do you do it with? And so when council asks, well, what are you doing? I said, well, what month is this? And, you know, if it's October, I can tell you what I'm doing, or if it's February, I can tell you what I'm doing. Like, say, for example, we're in December, so we're just reconciling our role because we're going to be accepting our new role as of January. And for us, that means we're really interested in seeing what our new construction is going to bring us, or as the term that they use, BC assessment, non-market change. That is your new construction. That'll tell you what kind of new revenue that you're going to be able to generate. And you won't have to put the squeeze on the other people to generate that. You know, like, all depends on what happens in your market. And, you know, and in Kelowna, you know, like, that's which establishes our benchmarks for our values on Westbank First Nation. It's one of the highest in the country. Now, it used to be a very good deal to come here and live here. Everybody still wants to come here and live here, but that cost has certainly gone up.
Mm-hmm. And it snows there too, Ernest. As my brother found out that just moved to Kelowna a couple years ago, it's like he's like, they have snow here. This is BS. He went to golf and he's like using a snowblower.
Well,
I think that's a really good point. Like for me, I'm gonna take that and share that at home. Is there's a I know at home they're worried that we're gonna lose a lot of our residential um, leaseholders once and it's kind of been happening already. I know they know it's coming. A lot of the homes and the cottages have gone to market in the last year. Mostly, I don't want to say because the tax is coming, but I think COVID played a lot of a role in that, and
Mhm.
and being able, using that information you just said that comment about, it costs more than it did, but there's still demand to live there in Kelowna. If I could move there, I would. So, so I think I'm gonna use that and communicate that to my council and our resort management is really scared that we're going to lose a lot of our cottagers.
Yeah, especially your cottagers would feed into all the natural casino and whatever else, right? They're feeders to come and utilize that stuff. So I get it because we only have one residential. We have a 123 condo unit that we tax, but that's the only residential at Enoch so far. But I think the other neat thing that you guys all pointed out when I'm sitting here thinking about it is that our networking, like since taking the courses at Tulu, and even prior to that, just getting to know Ernest and stuff and sharing with Enoch similarities to Kelowna, although we don't have an Okanagan, um, that has been really great to have that networking and to be able to pick up the phone and talk to whether it's Ernest or Ty or Trenton or David or whoever, that it's nice to have that resource because I never had that before I took the courses. And now that we have a team building thing, it's so nice to see each other and you become like a family within a family with taxation, I find. And, I said to Ernest this year, I gave him a phone call and said, hey, Ernest, when's our next workshop? We haven't had one because of the pandemic, that we need to get together here because I really miss those connections too. Because you do a lot of talking and networking and you have a lot of similarities. And also, it helps you to plan and maybe think of things differently of how to approach it in your community. So I think it's so important to have those networking opportunities with each other.
I totally agree. So, for those of our listeners that are unfamiliar, Ernest sits on the board for an organization or an association called the First Nations Tax Administrators Association, and that association oversees accreditation for tax administrators and also holds an annual conference, which before the pandemic was a great place for tax administrators to get together and just chat about some of the topics that we're chatting about now. And we are actually planning on doing an episode with some of the members of the FNTAA board just to learn a little bit more about that association and just share some of the work that they do. So stay tuned on that one for sure. I appreciate that we've talked about residential taxpayers, commercial taxpayers, and utility taxpayers. And we've also talked a little bit there's a couple of people that on the call that tax under the FMA, the First Nations Fiscal Management Act, and then Ernest at Westbank taxes under Section 83 of the Indian Act, and that might be maybe people don't understand the differences between some of those things. So I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on those differences. And Anna, I know you were under Section 83 at Enoch before, and now the FMA. So what is that? What
Well, we just found that under Section 83 it was good because we had our tax law that we implemented in the 70s. So I always tell Manny Jules, hey, we were there before FMA really because we were in the 70s. But it was a nice sort of that you could use the Indian Act, but as you know, everybody's kind of going away from the Indian Act. So leadership had talked way back in 2015, 2017 that maybe we should join FMA and maybe we would be stronger because I think there's like over 200 bands now that are with FMA. And anyway, when we looked at it, we had Trenton come out and do a spiel to us at a leadership meeting in Kelowna during one of our workshops. And we just found that we might be stronger and there's toolkits and there's different resources available that you're not on your own then, and you're keeping up to date with what's going on. I think it's been very useful. And I understand, though, by Ernest and them are still under Section 83. It's worked for them and it was working for Enoch, but I just think it was nice that we did have the change, but you can still be involved with the First Nations Tax Commission, even if you're Section 83 or FMA. So you don't have to feel forced to change that. One's not better than the other. It's whatever works for you as a nation, and you just go with it. It gives you power regardless of what you're under. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was you had mentioned a little about the fng.ca website. That I always point that out to council because that's one of the things the tax commission had put together before. And basically everybody's laws, every kind of BCR that you made is in there. So I always tell Enoch, you can look at some of your ancestors' laws, whether it's an animal control law or they had like a weed thing at Enoch that you couldn't have this notorious weed thing, but now we have cannabis. So it's kind of neat for them. It's kind of neat for them to look at some of these laws that, hey, maybe we should actually get that one out. And there was a traffic law and everything else, but it's neat that they have compiled for all of Canada all of your laws within an FNG so that you can have a look back and see what you've done. And they really help, and you can snoop and look at other people's laws too from the other bands. So it's really helpful.
As the former communications officer for the First Nations Tax Commission, some of the topics that you're talking about are very close to my heart. The Section 83 bylaw digitization project is where we worked with the federal government to take archived laws and get them in there to be more accessible as a resource. And the ability to go back in time, as you say, to some of these laws that were created in the very early days. But then also even current laws, if you're looking at building out a new law, the ability to go and reference similar laws from other First Nations across the country in terms of like benchmarking and just seeing what's out there, it is a really helpful resource that for anybody, for any Canadian to be able to kind of research those laws and see what's going on First Nation lands. Anna talked about Section 83 and Ernest. It's working quite well for Westbank. I wondered if you had any thoughts on Section 83 taxation.
Oh, absolutely. I'll tell you the reason why Westbank First Nation is still under the Indian Act and the ministerial oversight. Well, because when they were negotiating their Self-Government Act, the people, the non-member residents, which at the time there was I think 8,500 that were living here, and they just weren't comfortable with if self-government meant that that it would be in right of Westbank instead of right of Canada. And the people that lived here and their leasehold interests, they felt certainly a lot more comfortable with the ministerial oversight. And so that's the reason why Westbank hadn't changed. But after the Self-Government Act was established, that's when the First Nation Tax Commission and the FMA came into effect, was a year later. And there's a section of a regulation that has to be amended, and a section of the FMA that prevents self-governing First Nations from joining. And the real question is, because if you look at who belongs, there's not one single self-governing First Nation that belongs to FMA. And there's a reason for that. It's because the language is restrictive in accordance with your self-government and your ability as a self-governing First Nation to acquiesce that jurisdiction. It just can't be done. And that has to be worked on and redeveloped to a point where there's some give and take between self-governing First Nations and FMA. That's where the real issues are.
Yeah, I think you've raised some great points, and even we saw in the early days of the FMA when it launched, there needed to be some updates, some legislative amendments, just because as you begin working with new legislation, you start to see these issues. And I know the First Nations Tax Commission and the other FMA institutions and all the First Nations work really closely together on looking for at what's next in terms of where we're going with some of this work that we're doing, because it can be quite a complicated landscape as First Nation jurisdiction and administration and governance, as you all well know.
And sometimes one fit doesn't fit everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it's good to have, like, we had our legal counsel involved with FMA too, and we made the changes to our main laws of 2016. So we went back and forth a couple times, but that's where you get your own legal counsel too, to make sure that it fits for what you're doing.
Ty, I can't recall if White Bear was under Section 83 at the start, or did you enter the FMA? Was there a transition, or was it an FMA only?
Um, from the records that I was able to get, we actually did transition from Section 83. Um, but I had very little information. I came in, we were already scheduled under the act, and from what I have been able to track down in some of the information from council who were there when they did shift, it was because of a capacity issue. There was no enforcement on our taxes. Basically, the only taxes we were able to collect were from the oil field and our pipeline. They did unsuccessfully try to implement it within our resort, but I think the scope of the project was just too big for one person back then. And when we shifted into the FMA, I think they saw the need for capacity building and all the supports that you were going to get under the FMA, and that's what led them to shifting out of the Indian Act into the FMA, was just all the supports that you had and the capacity help. And you know, for me, I think for White Bear in our current regime, commercial property taxes with the FNTC toolkit, you know, it was easy for me to jump in and kind of establish some integrity in our system. I wasn't really familiar with the Section 83 regime.
I can imagine that transition would have been quite a bit of work, and we've already spent a bit of time talking about what the day-to-day and what the annual cycle looks like for each of you, and it sounds quite busy. But I know that you also have to fit in some other forward-looking projects. So beyond that day-to-day work, what are some of the projects that you have on your horizon?
Well, for me, for White Bear, I've kind of talked a little bit about it, but when I came in 2018, I was told that we needed to implement residential property tax on our White Bear Lake Resort development. Back in the early, I guess, back in the 1940s, our land was leased to the adjacent town, and they developed a resort on our lands, and that was administrated by our Indian agent and whoever else was involved back then. I guess the town council. But when that had lease expired in 1979, our nation assumed the management of that development, and they saw the benefit of having it, and they saw that, you know, it was a revenue maker. Sorry, for lack of a better term, but it did bring in a lot of revenue for the town, and we wanted to take that back over and establish and implement our jurisdiction over our lands. But we didn't have the tools that they have today, especially with the FMA, in order to implement a property tax regime there. And that's the project that I'm working on right now, is that property tax implementation. And when I came in straight out of Tulo, like I came in like full ready to roll this out, and use all my training and all the education that Tulo gave me to 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 make these people pay. They needed to pay right now as soon as I got there. But you know, it was a pretty steep learning curve. In Saskatchewan, they do a 4 year assessment cycle, so that played a big role in why things were so delayed. Sam only does regional assessments, and we had to wait for them to come back into our region to get our assessment done, and that was just done last year, and COVID actually delayed that by a year. So uh, our assessment wasn't done until mid June of 2022. It was supposed to be done um, early January 2021. So with that delay and then plus their 4 year assessment cycle, it was a steep learning curve for me because I was with the training at Tulo. Every other province does an annual assessment for their when they in their cycles. So it was pretty much a waiting game for me. But yeah, that's the big project that I'm working on is implementing our residential property tax, and it's going to bring in about early estimation between 1.5 and 1.7 million a year in annual tax revenue.
That's so great. What
Cool.
about you, Anna?
Well, for we have several different things. I've been trying to get a DCC law, which is a development capital cost law, done at Enoch, but it's been a tough one to try get done because we have so many people that approach us because Enoch is so close to the city of Edmonton, and a lot of them see us as a gold mine. So some of them think that we can build on your property, but then they don't want to help with the capital cost. So anyway, and Westbank has been a good learning tool that way, is to make sure that a lot of these guys that want to develop, that they pay for the capital cost instead of us looking for
Mm-hmm.
grants and different things for them to develop. But sometimes it's hard to sell it to leadership because maybe the leadership just wants to build, but sometimes we're being used because there's lots of people out there that will use you too, for projects. So I think it's a safety net. So hopefully, I've given a draft to CNC and to our legal to sort of have a look at it, and just for, I sort of put it in their thought process, like, here's the law that I'm thinking about. Have a look at it, see what you think, and it's a safety net law that helps us with that. So I've left it on the table with leadership for the last couple months now, and last year I did that too. So we'll see what happens. The other big thing we're working on, of course, is we have a health project that is a private center, but there's pros and cons to that. It's a private clinic for hip replacement and stuff. That it's good and bad. I know other people got into trouble with trying to do these health projects too. Um, so it's sort of pros and cons to that. Some people like it, some people don't, but it's something that they're working on at Enoch. Um, the other thing that we're working on, of course, is the big fact thing that Ty and I just went to Vancouver for our leadership 2 weeks ago, I think on the 30th, for the meeting with Manny Jules. And the fact thing is, for your fuel, your alcohol, your cannabis, and your tobacco tax, that for Enoch, that's going to generate a lot of money. Because I mean, we're busy. We're the top gas station in Alberta. So for gas and tobacco, we
Mm.
know we're number one already. So those are going to be huge revenues that instead of paying to the province of Alberta, that we can pay to back to us and our taxation local revenues. And then of course we have a cannabis shop, and we also have alcohol because we're a casino. And we're very busy. So I'm looking forward to implementing that kind of tax, and it's going to really generate a lot of more revenues into our general taxation budget. So those are some of the things that we have that we're working on.
Oh, that's pretty exciting. At Westbank, it's not that we wouldn't want to be part of FMA. So don't get me wrong about that. Uh, in the past 3 years, I've been working to develop those laws. So we're FMA ready to go. I mean, like we've redeveloped our assessment law and our tax law, and brought those all up to speed. So I mean, it's not like we haven't been working towards that. It's just that we keep on running up against that, um, the regulation aspect of it, like to amend that. you know, it's, we would, there's another tax revenues that we'd be able to uh, collect is the property transfer tax. For us, it's huge. It'd be
Mm-hmm.
like 2 million bucks. Um, and I like that the fact tax. I mean, we already have three of the four. We just need to continuously or finish developing the cannabis part of it, because we already collect and we collect. You know, it has been as high as 2.5, but different things, health issues, uh, downturns in different economies have made that tax. So we're collecting the three products now. I think it's 1.7 for us.
Yeah, it's
Um,
huge.
so there's certainly some significant revenues that we want to collect, provided that we could. And so we've been looking at other ways, even thinking about the current Indian Act and what it says about the property transfer tax, and the language is almost identical. The reason that the property transfer tax was pushed by FMA was because it was new. They wanted to say, okay, well, why concentrate on the Indian Act when you can have the newest, most modern laws now in that jurisdiction? So we understand that, but we've certainly looked at, because of our limitations of not being able to uh, find that compromise in order to get into FMA. We looked at the Indian Act and have developed we've also developed a law for that. I mean, it's not like we're not doing anything.
No, no,
Uh,
it sounds like that's like it's no small feat. Your your fuel, alcohol, and tobacco taxes is three times my revenue. So it's something a bit of a striving for, you know.
Yeah.
It's
The other thing
awesome.
I should
yeah,
mention. Oh,
no,
that,
go ahead.
go ahead, Ernest. Are you? If you're not finished, go ahead. That's an important thing about fact. I'll just mention after you're done.
Well, what I was going to say was that, right now, the Indian Act jurisdiction that we do have, it generates for us this year, it's going to be over 18 million in our property tax. So, it's not something that you can sneeze at.
Hmm.
We're very active, and like we have about 5,500 folios right now. So I've had to hire an extra person. So we got three people in our department now.
Wow.
Yeah. So like that's like for me, I think Westbank taxing under the Indian Act, is probably the most efficient way to do things. Like bringing on a lot of liability through the FMA. That's a lot of work, and I understand where you're coming from there, and I appreciate like hearing that you guys, you've done all your due diligence to get there, but you're standing firm on your jurisdiction. It's
Hmm.
awesome.
I think in the conversations that I've had with people, non-Indigenous people, some of the work that I do, the people that I talk to, just talking about these concept of taxation, and just I find that people find it very interesting that there's all of these tax powers with these other levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal, but then there's this gap on in First Nation communities on our lands, and so looking at ways to break free from dependency and create our own revenues to support our communities, to build our economies. I mean, of course, we're all passionate about that. That's why we're here. Um, when I think about Indigenous reconciliation and what that means, I mean, for me, a big part of it means economic reconciliation. and working to find ways that we can all, like Manny does say, like be great and good and share in the resources and the wealth in these lands. And the work that you each are doing is so important, and hearing the work that you've got ahead of you, the innovations that you're thinking about, has just really been incredible. So thank you so much for taking the time today to chat with us and just share some of your perspectives. I've really appreciated it.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Well,
It's been cool. Yeah. Looking forward to the next one.